Hi, welcome to Supervision Training for Child Placing Agency staff. In this training, you will become familiar with minimum standards requirements related to supervision of children in care. You will reflect on multiple options for compliance in various scenarios. Consider how to implement best practices for compliance at your organization, and also consider concerns and opportunities for compliance at your organization. A couple of notes about the format of this PowerPoint. First, there will be the topic question of the rule and minimum standards as it relates to supervision. Then will be the details of the standard that applies to supervision. However, only the portion of the standard that is related to supervision is being listed. Please note there are often multiple other details related to each standard, and we encourage you to review minimum standards fully. In most cases, the standards will be reviewed in chronological order, as this tends to follow the general flow of the case. We are going to review each supervision standard and encourage you to think through how each of those standards looks in practice and be brainstorming ways to problem solve any challenges to compliance with those standards. And then at the end, we will review some scenarios and encourage you to reflect on how to maintain compliance in each of those scenarios. There are quite a few licensing standards related to supervision. Take just a few minutes and think about some of the reasons for that. Also, take a moment and reflect on how our cultural beliefs impact our beliefs about how to supervise children. There are many reasons that supervision is so important, not the least of which is that it is paramount for the safety of kids in care. There are also multiple things to consider when looking at supervision in various situations. Youth are new to your environment and you don't have a shared history with them, so supervision becomes really important. There are a multitude of other reasons. Take a few moments and think about those. What information must I, the child placing agency, provide to caregivers when admitting a child to care? The child placing agency must inform appropriate caregivers of any special needs, such as medical or dietary needs, or conditions or supervision needs, and document that the information was shared with the caregiver. As a reminder, we are only pulling out the sections of standards that specifically address supervision. There are plenty of other things that the child placing agency is required to share with caregivers. There are a few things to consider when it comes to this standard. One, consider where would you document this information? This is going to vary depending on your organization, but make sure that you're familiar with your organization's internal practices around documentation and where this information needs to be documented. Also, think about what might be some challenges to this rule. We're required to share pertinent information with caregivers, but if a child is new to care, we might not have some of that information. So, what would you do in those scenarios? One consideration might be to increase supervision until we know more information about the child. Now let's look at the requirements for a preliminary service plan as it pertains to supervision. Remember, there are many other requirements for a preliminary service plan, but we are just going to look at those parts related to supervision. So, those things say you must complete a preliminary service plan that addresses the immediate needs of the child within 72 hours, such as supervision requirements, such as enrolling the child in school or obtaining needed medical care or clothing. That preliminary service plan needs to include a description of how you will meet the child's needs, including any necessary increased supervision or follow-up actions of possible side effects of medication or treatment provided to the child. Now let's take a look at the requirements for an initial service plan as it pertains to supervision. The initial service plan must include specific goals and strategies to meet the child's needs, including instructions to caregivers responsible for the care of the child. Instructions must include specific information about the level of supervision required for the child. So, this training is not a training on normalcy, but we do need to talk about how we can balance normalcy with supervision needs. And that is addressed somewhat in Minimum Standard 749.2603. So, we do know that children in care must participate in childhood activities, including unsupervised childhood activities, as much as possible. But we know we do also need to be concerned with supervision. So, a good time to discuss that is during the service planning meetings with the child's treatment team and the child, so that any decision that's made regarding the child's need for supervision and normalcy and these unsupervised activities can be discussed at that time. We are going to discuss the basic care requirements for a toddler. But first, we want to clarify that per minimum standards, a toddler is defined as a child 18 months of age through 35 months of age. Per minimum standards, a toddler's caregiver must never leave the child unsupervised. However, a child is considered supervised if the caregiver is within eyesight or hearing range of the child and can intervene as needed. That's key. Or if the caregiver uses a video camera or an auto monitoring device to monitor the child and again is close enough to the child to intervene as needed. And we will talk a little further in this training about some of the other requirements around video and audio monitoring. What information must the child placing agency collect for the foster home screening? Once again, we are just talking about the information that you must collect for the foster home screening as it pertains to supervision. We all know that there is a myriad of other things that must be collected for the foster home screening. But in regards to supervision, the child placing agency must ensure and document that each foster parent is able to comprehend and benefit from training and provide appropriate care and supervision to meet the needs of children in care in areas such as health, education, and discipline behavior management. So we're assessing potential foster parents for their ability to supervise, amongst other things. You must document information from foster parents that demonstrate the ability to provide nurturing care, appropriate supervision, reasonable discipline, and a home-like atmosphere for children. Now we are going to look at the requirements that an agency must have with the foster home that they verify as it pertains to supervision. The agreement that the child placing agency has with a foster home that they verify must specify the following, amongst the list of other things: the foster parent's commitment to comply with your policies regarding child care, discipline, supervision of children, and children's visits or trips away from the foster home. Can a child placing agency verify a foster home to provide different services? The answer is it depends. For each placement of a child into a home verified to provide multiple types of service, a child placement staff must ensure that there will be no conflict of care. Examples of conflicts in care are placements that significantly compromise the care and supervision of any child in care. Think about if you have a home that is verified to serve children with emotional disorders at a treatment services level, and you've also got a home that's verified to serve children with primary medical needs. You would need to ensure that they're able to meet the needs of both sets of children. May a foster home exceed its verified capacity? The answer is in certain situations and if it doesn't compromise supervision. Specifically, it says children visiting the home or in the home for infrequent babysitting are not counted in the capacity of the home. However, the caregivers in the home must ensure that the presence of additional children in the home does not prevent adequate supervision of children in foster and respite childcare. The helpful information box following minimum standard 749.2563 provides some additional information. It says children attending an event in a foster home, such as a birthday party, Boy Scout meeting, etc., are not required to be counted in the child caregiver ratio. The child caregiver ratios only apply to biological and adopted children of the caregivers who live in the foster home, any children receiving foster or respite childcare in the home, and children for whom the family provides daycare. However, foster parents must ensure appropriate care and supervision to children in care during these events. So we're just seeing a common theme here that supervision is paramount in all of these situations. So, how am I responsible for ensuring adequate supervision of children in care? Now remember, this is referring to the child placing agency. So this is how the child placing agency is responsible for ensuring adequate supervision of children in care. It says your child placement management staff must ensure that supervision of children in care adequately accounts for the following: the specific needs of the children in care in each home, so it needs to be individualized; non-routine events taking place in the lives of children, the foster parents, or the group of children in care. So we know that sometimes kids might need additional supervision if they're particularly dysregulated for some reason. That's just one example. And the child's history, including background of abuse or neglect by caretakers, sexual or physical abuse against others, fire setting, maiming or killing animals, suicide attempts, and runaway behaviors. Your child placement management staff must also approve a written plan for the increased supervision of a child who presents an immediate harm to himself or others. Now let's look at what responsibilities a caregiver has when supervising a child. I think my favorite part of this standard is the very first one. It says the caregiver is responsible for knowing which children they are responsible for. Now, that might sound a little silly, but if you've got multiple caregivers in a home or at a particular situation, it's important that everybody know who's watching who. We don't want one parent thinking that the other parent is watching the child when really they're supposed to be watching the child. So that might sound silly, but that's important. Additionally, the caregiver is responsible for being aware of and accountable for each child's ongoing activity, providing the level of supervision necessary to ensure each child's safety and well-being, including auditory and or visual awareness of each child's ongoing activity as appropriate, and I would say as it says in their service plan, being able to intervene when necessary to ensure each child's safety. We've seen that before, being able to intervene when necessary, and not performing tasks that clearly impede the caregiver's ability to supervise and interact with the children while being responsible for the supervision and being able to meet any service planning requirements regarding supervision of any child, as I just mentioned. Let's talk about not performing tasks that clearly impede the caregiver's ability to supervise. There are some obvious things, such as substances, but there might be some less obvious ones. Maybe it's a single parent and they're mowing the grass. You need to make sure that you can still supervise the child and intervene if necessary. We are making a point of going through the minimum standards that relate to supervision. However, it is recommended that the section of minimum standards for child placing agencies titled Division 6 Supervision be reviewed in its entirety. What responsibilities does the caregiver have when supervising a child? We've already talked about some, but here are some additional ones. When supervising a child, a caregiver must take into account the surrounding circumstances, hazards, and risks. So, not every situation is going to be the same. Supervision: when supervising a child, a caregiver must take into account the child's needs. Caregivers counted in child caregiver ratio must provide a safe environment. Caregivers counted in child caregiver ratio must implement and follow the children's service plans, which we've mentioned before. In the child service plan, there will be some additional details that are specific and individualized to that child around that child's supervision needs. Let's talk about increasing supervision. Take a moment and just consider, when are some times you need to increase supervision? Think about some of those examples. And then think about, what are some ways you might do that? Some of the things that we considered were, you may need to increase supervision if a child is dysregulated. There are plenty of times that a child might be dysregulated. That could be during a time of transition. It might be following a visit. It might be following a therapy session, any number of other things. Also, you may need to increase supervision if a child is a danger to self or others, has had additional trauma, is engaging in a high risk activity. Typically, this is talking about high risk recreational activities, but it could certainly mean other things. Is at a risk of running away. Those are just to name a few examples. Plenty of other times when you may need to increase supervision. Some ways that you could increase supervision could be by keeping the child close to you, doing more frequent check ins, utilizing a monitor if appropriate, checking on the child through the night, and or making alternative sleeping arrangements that are more conducive to supervision. And we're going to discuss that a little further in a bit. And then don't forget what we mentioned on a previous slide, the standard that says your child placement management staff must also approve a written plan for the increased supervision of a child who presents an immediate harm to himself or others. Okay, as promised, let's discuss, may I use a video camera to supervise a child, specifically in the child's bedroom, is what these standards are referring to. So here are the rules. Video cameras may be used to supervise infants and toddlers. And remember, a toddler is a child through 35 months of age. Video cameras may not be used to supervise children other than infants and toddlers unless the following criteria are met. The parent or other person legally authorized to consent, such as DFPS, consents to the use of the video camera, and the child is younger than 5 years old, has primary medical needs, or has a service plan that permits the use for purposes of reducing risks of sexually offensive behavior, physical aggression, or other behaviors identified as requiring heightened supervision, such as night terrors, sleepwalks, or resides in a bedroom with such a child. You must document the justification for the video camera in the child's service plan, and the child must have other accessible and reasonable locations where he may change his clothing in private. So there are some times when you can use a video camera, but it is very specific scenarios and has to be approved and documented appropriately. Also, video cameras may not be used to tape the child, and the images may not be accessible except to the foster home's caregivers. May a child in care share a bedroom with an adult caregiver? To facilitate continuous supervision of a child, the caregiver may move a child to a location where the caregiver can directly and continuously supervise a child until there is no longer an immediate danger to self or others. However, the caregiver must provide comfortable sleeping arrangements for the child. And please note, children may not sleep in the same bed with an adult caregiver at any time. Continuing along those lines, what are the requirements for beds and bedding? Each foster child shall receive their own bed and mattress. But this does not prevent a child receiving respite care or requiring closer supervision from sleeping on a couch, sleeping bag, etc. for fewer than 7 days. So if for some reason you need to increase supervision and have that child closer to you, so you have them on a couch right outside your bedroom, that's okay if it is for the purpose of supervision and if it's for fewer than 7 days. We are going to briefly look at some additional considerations. Minimum standards has quite a lot to say about trampolines, transportation, and swimming pools. And we're not going to get into all of those details, but we just want to point out the pieces of that pertain to supervision. So what are the requirements for outdoor recreation equipment? I've listed here part of what it says about trampolines, and I'm not going to read the first part of that as it pertains to the equipment itself, but I do want to read bullet point number 4. A caregiver provides supervision on a trampoline as follows. For children under 12 years old, the caregiver must be immediately present, watching the children at all times, and enforcing safety rules and manufacturer's instructions, and able to respond in an emergency. Remember, we keep seeing that about ability to intervene. And for children 12 years old and over, the caregiver must be on the premises, visually check on the child or children at frequent intervals, and able to respond in an emergency. What are the special requirements for transporting a child who requires increased supervision or is non-ambulatory or non-mobile? A sufficient number of caregivers to meet the child's needs must accompany the child, and special provisions must be made for transporting non-ambulatory and non-mobile children. When necessary, this must include locks for wheelchairs and hydraulic lifts. So we're going to talk about the requirements for a pool at a foster home. I know I've said this repeatedly, but we are just looking at the part as it pertains to supervision. There are quite a few rules around swimming pools at foster homes, and that is a very, very high risk activity. So please be sure to follow all of the supervision and other requirements for pools at foster homes. This says the caregivers must inform children about house rules for use of the pool and appropriate safety precautions. Adult supervision and monitoring of safety features must be adequate to protect children younger than 12 years of age and children of any age who are not competent swimmers from unsupervised access to the pool. Caregivers must be able to clearly see all parts of the swimming area when supervising activity in the area. One of the important things to consider when it comes to pools in foster homes is that if the pool is in the backyard and there is not a separate fence around the swimming pool specifically, then the entire backyard is considered the pool area. So you can't have a child, for example, outside playing on the swing set, even if they're not in the pool, if they don't have the appropriate supervision. Keep that in mind because that's going to come back up. So in minimum standards, there is a helpful information box at the end of Rule 749.3133 that addresses this. It says a backyard fence may serve as the pool fence or wall if it meets all the fence, wall, and gate criteria in that section. Subsection A requires that children may not have unsupervised access to the pool area. Therefore, if the backyard fence serves as the pool fence or wall, then the children may not have unsupervised access to the backyard, and doors leading to the backyard must comply with the requirements of that standard. If the entire backyard is serving as the pool area, children may not be in the backyard without direct caregiver supervision. I'm going to read that last sentence again. If the entire backyard is serving as the pool area, children may not be in the backyard without direct caregiver supervision. Let's review some practice scenarios. Here's our first scenario. You are a caseworker visiting a foster home for a scheduled visit. The home has two biological children, ages 13 and 11, and two children in care, ages 9 and 7. You see through the window that all four children are playing outside in the backyard. The two kids in care are playing on the swing set near the swimming pool, while the two older children take turns jumping on the trampoline. Foster father is at work, and foster mother came to let you in the front door, leaving the children briefly unattended outside. Now, let's take a moment and reflect on some of the things that came up in that scenario. First of all, were any minimum standards violated in that scenario? Yes, children in care were left unsupervised in a pool area. And we know from what we reviewed earlier that that is against minimum standards. We'll talk about that more in just a bit. But what are some alternative ways foster mother might have handled that situation? I think there are quite a few options. Some of the ones that come to mind is that if the parent is expecting the visit, she can make sure she and the children are not outside. But maybe the kids just got home from school and need to be able to move around. So another option would be to tell the caseworker to come around through the backyard when he or she arrives. She could have had that conversation with them in advance. She could call and let them know, or she could have her phone with her. And when the doorbell rings, she could speak to the caseworker on the phone, and at that time, let the caseworker know to come around back. Or foster mom could always bring the children in with her to answer the door. Of course, that might lead to a power struggle, so she might want to be more proactive and avoid that. These are just some possible alternatives. There are plenty of others that I'm sure you can think of as well. And that's the point, is that there are plenty of alternatives, and we need to remember if there is a pool in the backyard, children in care cannot be in the backyard unsupervised, because that entire backyard then becomes the pool area. We don't want children having unsupervised access to the swimming pool. Let's look at another scenario. You are a caseworker visiting a foster home for an unscheduled visit. The single foster home has two children in care, twin girls ages 2. Foster mother left the children looking at books in their bedroom while she came to answer the door. She was carrying a baby monitor in her hand so she could hear and see the girls if needed. So based only on what you know from the scenario, do you think any minimum standards have been violated? Given only what we know from the scenario, likely not, unless there were additional requirements in the service plans for one or both of the children. Remember, audio and video monitors may be appropriate when supervising toddlers as long as the parent is able to intervene quickly if needed. So, what are some things that might make you more concerned with this scenario? Just some things to think about. It might be different if the girl's room was upstairs while foster mother was answering the door downstairs. It would depend. That might make it harder for her to intervene quickly if needed. Would you think it was different if the girls were currently dysregulated and prone to physical altercations with one another? Now, from what we know from the scenario, it sounded like they were calmly reading books. So I think it sounds like it was probably okay, but this could potentially be different. What if one of the girls had been left alone in the bathtub while foster mom used a baby monitor to supervise? I hope we all know that that would not be okay. Our purpose in these scenarios is not necessarily to have a specific right or wrong answer in every scenario, because we know there are multiple factors to consider. We just want to help you begin to think critically when it comes to supervision and to think of what are the different situations that need to be considered. Here's another scenario. You receive a call from one of your newly verified foster mothers. Janice, age 14, was placed in her home last night and has a history of aggressive behavior and running away. Foster mom shared that throughout the evening, Janice has seemed increasingly irritable. At dinner, she got into a verbal altercation with one of the other girls in the home. During an after dinner activity, she stated she wanted to punch her younger sister, with whom she shares a room. When it was time for her shower, she took longer than usual, had to be prompted several times to finish, after which she stomped to her room. She threw her dirty clothes on her sister's bed before getting in her own bed and pulling the covers over her face and yelling for everyone to leave her alone. Take a moment and reflect on these questions based on that previous scenario. What safety concerns do you have, if any? What recommendations might you give the foster mother? Would you recommend increasing supervision? If so, what might that look like? We're just going to look at some possible responses to those reflection questions. There could be potentially other responses as well, but these are some things to consider. One safety concern is that Janice might become aggressive with her sister. Another consideration is that since she is new to the home and currently somewhat dysregulated, we are unsure of how she might respond. It's different once you have some history with the child and might know how to prepare, but in this case, we don't know what to expect. The other thing to consider is one recommendation might be to provide supervision while avoiding a power struggle. Foster mom can check that Janice's immediate needs are being met, consider if she needs a glass of water, something to eat, or to move her body. If possible, perhaps foster mom could suggest going on a walk around the block together to help calm and regulate Janice while also connecting with her. And then there could be some increasing of supervision. Increasing supervision during times of uncertainty, transition, crisis, or when a child is new to the home, such as this case, is often a good response. Perhaps there could be frequent check-ins until the girls are asleep and periodic check-ins during the night. Maybe one of the girls is allowed to sleep elsewhere, such as another bedroom, the couch, etc., just for the night. Our goal with these scenarios is to consider each situation critically and look at the variety of factors to make the best decision. Help your foster families learn to critically assess situations as well. Consider other possible responses to these sample scenarios and other common supervision concerns, and discuss those with your supervisor or team during your next meeting. Thank you so much for reviewing this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.